Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know what? It's just another great night for democracy, and it's always an honor to rise on behalf of Canada's #1 riding, Mission Matsqui Fraser Canyon, and share a few words in the People's House of Commons. In this year's budget, Conservatives asked for a couple of things, 3 things to be exact: to bring home powerful paychecks, to bring home lower prices on homes, and to bring more home and to build more homes that Canadians can afford. Budget 2023 does none of these things. It fails to create the good-paying jobs that Canadians need to keep up with the ever-rising cost of living, and it fails to stop this government's reckless spending and punishing tax hikes that are driving inflation. And it fails to deliver a real plan to address the housing supply crisis and ensure Canadians can find a safe and affordable place to call home. Further, it fails to address the labor shortages that are holding small businesses back. It fails to cut the mountains of red tape that have made Canada an unattractable place to do business. And it cuts away the fiscal anchor that the finance minister so proudly touted in Budget 2022, a declining debt-to-GDP ratio. For these reasons, Mr. Speaker, I'll be joining my colleagues in voting against the budget. On bringing home powerful paychecks, paychecks aren't keeping up with the cost of living. I hear this from constituents every single day. Canada's inflation rate for April 2023 sat at 4.4%. Groceries are seeing some of the highest increases. In April, food prices rose 8.3% over the same month last year. Canada's food price report for 2023 predicts the average family of 4 will spend $1,065 more on food this year. And all this government can offer Canadians is a grocery rebate that won't come close to covering this substantial increase to their most important expense every month. The average family of 4 will still be out $598. The Prime Minister's advice to Canadians who can't keep up with this inflation: just put big, important purchases on your credit card. With the cost of a home reaching all-time highs, does the Prime Minister think Canadians should put their down payment on their credit card too? Budget 2023 doubles down on the failed $70 billion national housing strategy that since its implementation, we've seen a doubling of the cost of an average family home in this country. Conservatives have a different plan. We're going to get municipal gatekeepers and NIMBYs out of the way. In fact, we're going to work with what the provincial NDP government in British Columbia is doing and work with municipalities to incentivize them to get more homes built. We're going to tie infrastructure dollars to increase housing development, and we're going to sell off 15% of the federal government's buildings to be converted into affordable housing. Turning to small businesses, the housing supply crisis is also preventing small businesses from attracting new workers, particularly in rural communities. Ashcroft and Lillooet in my riding have raised this repeatedly. On top of this, businesses struggle to bring in workers from abroad thanks to massive backlogs in our broken immigration system. In fact, just last week I had the pleasure of attending the BC Chamber of Commerce AGM and 2023 conference, where they called upon the federal government as one of their key policy planks to address the immigration shortfalls. A recent CFIB report highlighted that small business owners are working 54 hours a week on average, largely to make up for these staffing shortages. Labor shortages have had a particular impact on small businesses in the hospitality and agricultural sectors, where 84% and 82% of owners report working more hours respectively. On top of labor shortages, most businesses are having trouble simply staying afloat. Many took on large amounts of debt to survive the pandemic. However, they have yet to fully recover to 2019 levels and are drowning in debt payments. According to Restaurants Canada, there has been a 116% increase in bankruptcies among restaurants over the last year, and 51% are only breaking even or are losing money every day. Small businesses ask for no more carbon tax hikes, a reduction of the small business tax rate, and action to address the labor shortages. Instead, they got continued carbon tax hikes, no tax relief, and no action to clear the immigration backlogs that we face. I would be remiss, Mr. Speaker, if I didn't mention the village of Lytton in my riding. We're coming up on the 2-year anniversary on June 30th, when Lytton was consumed by wildfire. Nearly 2 years later, the rebuild has yet to begin. Residents of Lytton have been unable to return home, and businesses have been unable to reopen their doors. Many businesses took out CEBA loans during the pandemic to stay afloat, but without the ability to reopen, many are unable to repay them. With the deadline for repayment coming up this December, these businesses are running out of time and are desperate. Earlier this week, I received a reply to one of my petitions from constituents in Lytton, where they pleaded with the government to please give them some reprieve. We're only talking about a dozen businesses here. And the government said no. They said no to the village that has been referenced in any conversation on climate change, any conversation on natural disasters, and for the very people that want to be able to go back and rebuild the community. The government said no. Shame on them. I will acknowledge Minister of Pacific Economic Development did follow through on some housing supports, but rental housing was excluded from that as well. And I really hope that the government revises its program on the housing grants to include rental housing moving forward. In British Columbia, we're also facing the opioid crisis. In 2016, an increase in the number of overdose deaths in BC, particularly those linked to fentanyl, led the medical officer of health to declare a public health emergency in the province. In the 7 years leading up to that declaration, 3,002 British Columbians lost their lives to a drug overdose, an average of about 430 a year. Since 2017, there have been 10,396 deaths from opioid overdoses, an average of more than 1,700 per year. At the federal level, more than $6 billion has been spent since 2017, yet the crisis worsens. Conservatives are committed to turning hurt into hope for those battling with addiction. A few weeks ago, I hosted a number of people who have combated addiction in their life and overcome it. And they talked about the need in the Fraser Health region to put more money into detoxification beds. The Fraser Health region, my health region in British Columbia, has the highest overdose deaths in this country. Mr. Speaker, and we only have 8 detox beds. I think moving forward, we need to be in a position, and the Government of Canada needs to support a policy position that if someone who is suffering from an opioid addiction feels that they can enter treatment, that treatment is available on demand. The number of people that die from opioids far surpassed the number of people that die from COVID-19. We spent hundreds of billions of dollars on COVID-19, yet not a fraction of that for the people that are suffering from opioid addiction. Canada must do better. British Columbia must do better. Our children and the parents of those who have lost a child are pleading with us to do better. We haven't done good enough, Mr. Speaker. So in conclusion, Budget 2023 won't address the ever-increasing cost of living that we're facing in British Columbia and across Canada. It won't create the good-paying jobs that Canadians need to keep up with the cost of inflation. And it fails to address the #1 issue in my riding, the rebuilding of Lytton, and the overdose crisis that is plaguing my province at an alarming rate. We have so much work to do in this House, and the Conservative Party, Her Majesty's loyal opposition, is going to fight every day to make sure that Canadians see a future for themselves, see a future in their communities that is drug-free, where people have hope to live their best lives once again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I appreciate the comments from my friend and colleague across the way, and I regret to have to play a little bit of fact check, but first on foreign direct investment, there's a 5-year snapshot of the foreign direct investments in the last 5 years is upwards of 1,141 billion. So over $1 trillion is an average. In the Harper years, it was almost half of that, $617 billion over a 5-year period per year. So foreign direct investment, there's really no comparing the federal Liberal government to the Conservative government. They just weren't able to attract the same level of investment. Next, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure why the Speaker wants to compare COVID-19 to opioid deaths. However, more Canadians did die from COVID-19, tragically, than opioids. Opioids have consumed far too many lives in this country, and we need to find solutions for, yes, both treatment and more safe supply. It is not a simple solution. It is complex. Now, lastly, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite lives in a province with carbon pricing, and they've effectively demonstrated an ability to reduce carbon emissions. So I'd ask him, he ran on it in the last election, will he stand up and tell his constituents that he no longer believes in carbon pricing?
Let me address the first and third question to begin with. The reason why we have so much foreign direct investment is because of LNG Canada. In fact, much of the manufacturing we're seeing in Western Canada, much of the investments we're seeing are related to pipelines and natural gas development. The natural gas development, which was the largest private sector investment in the history of Canada, put forward by the Liberal Prime Minister, was exempt from the carbon tax. That's the only reason they built it, was because they knew with the carbon tax it didn't make economic sense for that project to go ahead. The Prime Minister and the Premier of British Columbia decided not to apply the highest carbon tax in our country when that project went forward. When that project is completed in the next 5 years, we are going to have an exorbitant amount of skilled workers in northern British Columbia that won't have another project to go to, because under this government's Bill C-69 from the 2015 Parliament, barely any single natural resource development project has been approved. We got to get more natural resource projects approved to supply Asia with clean LNG Canada that's actually going to reduce global emissions and fight climate change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You know, our colleague has grievances with regards to the budget. It's the official opposition. They don't like the budget. And that's our case too, Mr. Speaker. We think there's a lot of things missing from this budget. You know what we'll do? We'll respect Parliament and we'll vote against the budget. The Conservatives are talking about their virtues and saying, here are their conditions, 1, 2, 3, 4, the carbon tax needs to be abolished. And as long as the government isn't respecting our conditions, not only will we not be voting for the budget, well, we'll be obstructing it. Mr. Speaker, everyone knows this is just a show to have us waste time. They'll never vote in favor of the budget. They're just lacking respect for parliamentarians' time. I'd like the member to tell me, to give me one example of one time in Canadian history where the official opposition supported a government's budget. I will not give an excuse for the Conservative Party. We are here to take on the government, to maintain Canadians' capacity to have a high standard of living. We need to oppose this budget because this budget is not good for Canada. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
I share his concern about the opioid crisis, as does everyone in this Parliament. And I was pleased to hear that he didn't repeat some of the misguided falsehoods that his leader has been putting out there in the media when it comes to safe supply in the province. I'm sure as a British Columbian, he's familiar with the words of the chief coroner and the provincial health officer, who have said there's no evidential basis for linking an increase in opioid deaths to the safe supply that we're seeing. My question for him, I think where we really strongly agree is the need for treatment programs. That one of the pillars of responding to the opioid and toxic drug crisis is having free treatment on demand. And my question is, would he support a federal fund directed to establishing those kinds of treatment centers in our province?
Well, I think the answer is yes. We would support treatment on demand, and I think that's one area where we see some collaboration between two parties in the House of Commons. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.